He was thrilled and delighted. And so he said, honey, you gotta come. And so I said, I would adore to.
When the will of Princess Lee Radziwill was unsealed in a quiet New York courtroom in 2019, the high society whispers reached a fever pitch. For 85 years, she had lived a life of nomadic glamour, forever cast as the spare to Jackie Kennedy's heir. But the final document revealed a surprising twist. Her entire fortune was destined for just one person. It wasn't a Kennedy nor a charity. It was a final, calculated act of legacy. The final will and testament, a masterclass in control. To the outside world, Lee Radziwill was the eternal runner-up. In the grand Shakespearean drama of the Bouvier sisters, Jackie was the queen, and Lee was the princess, literally by marriage, but never by stature in the American consciousness. Yet, in the quiet, sterile environment of a Manhattan probate court, 5 weeks after her death, in February 2019, Lee Radziwill finally claimed the center stage. She did so not with a fashion statement, but with a legal one. The reading of a will is often a moment of clarity, stripping away the curated layers of a public life to reveal the private architecture of a family's dynamics. For Lee, this was her final edit. The document, signed just months before her passing at age 85, was a surgical strike. It bypassed the sprawling branches of the Kennedy and Radziwill trees to land squarely on one person, her daughter, Anna Christina Tina Radziwill. But it wasn't just the who that set the Upper East Side abuzz, it was the how much and the why not. For years, the rumor mill that the relentless engine of New York society had suggested that Lee was living on the fumes of her former glory. There were whispers that she was house poor, that she was quietly offloading her legendary jewelry collection to maintain her 3-bedroom apartment on East 72nd Street and her summer lifestyle in the Hamptons. The Kennedy family, by most accounts, believed she was struggling. They were wrong. The unsealing of her estate documents revealed a hidden fortune estimated at $50 million. It was a staggering sum for a woman who spent half a century being characterized as the impoverished sister in comparison to Jackie's billionaire-adjacent status. This was Lee's "I told you so" from the grave. She hadn't been struggling, she had been strategizing. The most biting revelation, however, lay in the deliberate omissions. Lee's will was a document of profound exclusivity. She didn't just leave her money to Tina, she pointedly excluded others, most notably her daughter-in-law, Carol Radziwill. The journalist and Real Housewives of New York star was left out of the primary inheritance. The will contained a specific, almost clinical clause stating that Lee had already provided for her daughter-in-law during her lifetime. To the casual observer, it seemed like a standard legal safeguard. To those who knew the history, it was a chilly coda to a relationship that had withered after the tragic death of Lee's son, Anthony, in 1999. By leaving her fortune to Tina alone, Lee was ensuring that the Radziwill bloodline, as she defined it, remained the sole custodian of her legacy. The estate wasn't just cash and stocks. It was a museum of a life lived at the absolute peak of 20th century aestheticism. There were the French antiques from her Paris apartment on the Avenue Montaigne, the botanical prints that had become her signature, and the gifts from Hitler, a bronze eagle siphoned from the Berlin bunker that she kept as a morbid curiosity. Every piece of jewelry, every Giacometti lamp, and every scrap of couture was funneled toward Tina. Why the secrecy? Why let the world believe she was failing? For Lee, mystery was the ultimate luxury. She had spent her life being scrutinized by her mother, by Jackie, and by a public that wanted to see her as a tragic figure. By hiding her wealth, she maintained a level of privacy that her sister could never achieve. She was poor only by the impossible standards of the Onassis fortune, but in reality, she was a woman of immense independent means. The $50 million was more than just money. It was evidence of her survival. She had outlived the Cartier curse that seemed to plague the men in her life. She had outlived the sister who overshadowed her, and she had done it while maintaining a standard of living that required a small army of staff and a wardrobe that cost more than most Manhattan townhouses. The inheritance was also a message to the Kennedys. While she remained close to her niece Caroline, Lee's will was a firm boundary. She was not a Kennedy. She was a Bouvier and a Radziwill. Her fortune was not to be absorbed into the vast, complex machinery of the Kennedy trusts. It was to remain hers, passed down through her chosen line. As the news of the will broke, it painted a picture of Lee that was far more calculating and powerful than the fashion icon label usually allowed. She wasn't just a woman who knew how to wear a shift dress. She was a woman who knew how to manage a legacy. She understood that in the world she inhabited, money was the only thing that spoke louder than style. By leaving everything to Tina, she simplified the narrative. There would be no public squabbling, no auction house wars between cousins, and no dilution of the Radziwill brand. One has to look back at the shadow she spent 80 years trying to escape to understand why Lee felt the need to claim this final victory. The Sister Act, in the shadow of the silk veil. If the 50 million inheritance was the final period at the end of Lee's life, the preceding decades were a long, beautifully punctuated sentence written in the shadow of her older sister. To understand why Lee Radziwill felt the need to lock her fortune away for a single heir, one must understand the psychological warfare of the Bouvier sisters. It was a relationship defined by a parasitic brand of love, intensely close, yet fueled by a competition so fierce it could chill a room in the middle of a Palm Beach summer. From the nursery at Lasata, their grandfather's estate in East Hampton, the roles were cast. Janet Auchincloss, their mother, was a woman who viewed her daughters as social currency. Jackie was the thoroughbred, the intellectual, the stoic, the one groomed for the winner's circle. Lee, 3.5 years younger, was the pretty one. It sounds like a compliment, but in the Bouvier household, being the pretty one was a consolation prize. It suggested that while Jackie had substance, Lee merely had a surface. Lee spent the better part of 8 decades trying to prove that her surface was more refined, more curated, and more international than her sister's. When Jackie married a rising political star named John F. Kennedy, Lee countered by marrying a Polish prince, Stanislaw Stas Radziwill. For a brief moment, Lee held the higher title. She was a princess, living in a majestic home at 4 Buckingham Place in London, hosting the kind of European royalty that made the Boston Brahmins look like nouveau riche. Then came 1960. The moment JFK ascended to the presidency, the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. Suddenly, Lee wasn't just the sister of a senator's wife. She was the sister of the most famous woman in the world. The world wanted to see them together, the royal sisters of the new frontier. But the cameras always seemed to linger a second longer on Jackie. The rivalry was rarely loud. It was played out in the nuances of the look. If Jackie wore a pillbox hat, Lee wore a headscarf tied with the precision of a Parisian sculptor. If Jackie renovated the White House, Lee helped her, bringing in the legendary decorator Billy Baldwin to ensure the executive mansion had the Lee touch. There was a persistent, nagging suspicion in Lee's mind that she was the one with the superior taste, the one who truly understood the difference between rich and chic, while Jackie simply had the bigger stage to perform on. Their letters to each other were masterpieces of passive aggression wrapped in silk. "Dearest Jax," Lee would write, offering advice on everything from hemline lengths to the nuances of Italian protocol, always positioning herself as the sophisticated mentor to her unrefined American sister. But the resentment was a two-way street. Jackie, despite her global adoration, was reportedly envious of Lee's freedom. Lee could go to the south of France with Aristotle Onassis. Lee could join the Rolling Stones on tour. Lee could live a life of hedonistic aestheticism without the burden of being a national symbol. The ultimate betrayal, of course, arrived in the form of a yacht. When Lee introduced her sister to the Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis, she didn't realize she was handing over her own future. Lee had been the one enjoying Onassis's hospitality first. She was the one who felt a genuine connection to the rugged, billionaire lifestyle he offered. When Jackie married him in 1968, it wasn't just a marriage. It was a land grab. Jackie had taken the White House, and now she had taken the man who could have provided Lee with the ultimate financial security. Lee's reaction was a study in practiced composure. She famously said, "I'm happy for my sister," but friends noted that the light in her eyes had hardened into something metallic. This theft of Onassis was perhaps the catalyst for Lee's lifelong obsession with her own financial independence. She realized that relying on the great men or the great sister was a losing game. Even in death, Jackie managed to get the last word. When Jackie passed away in 1994, her will was a public document of devastating brevity regarding Lee. Jackie left her sister nothing, famously stating that she had already provided for her during her lifetime. The exact same phrase Lee would later use in her own will to exclude her daughter-in-law. It was a cold, final dismissal. Lee spent the final 25 years of her life determined to rewrite that ending. She didn't want to be the sister who was provided for. She wanted to be the woman who provided. The wealth she left behind wasn't just a trust fund for Tina. It was a bank statement, proving that she had won the long game. She had lived better, lasted longer, and died wealthier than anyone, especially the ghost of her sister, ever expected. The London years and the Radziwill reign. While the world viewed Lee through the lens of Camelot, she was busy constructing a far more cosmopolitan identity in the heart of London. In 1959, she married Prince Stanislaw Albrecht Radziwill, a Polish aristocrat known as Stas. The marriage was her ticket out of the American provincialism she so loathed and into the true jet set, a term coined for the very circle she and Stas came to define. As a princess, Lee finally held a title that her sister, despite all her power, could never claim. Their home at 4 Buckingham Place became the epicenter of a new kind of international glamour. It wasn't the stiff, stuffy elegance of the British aristocracy, but a vibrant, eclectic mix of high art, political power, and raw celebrity. Lee was the conductor of this orchestra. She didn't just host parties, she curated experiences. Her drawing room was a place where you might find a member of the British royal family sharing a cocktail with Rudolf Nureyev or Truman Capote. This was the era where Lee's eye became her greatest asset. She worked with the legendary Renzo Mongiardino to create interiors that felt like 18th century stage sets, lush, layered, and utterly indifferent to the minimalist trends of the time. She lived in a world of Sicilian silks, Port-Holt linens, and Turkish rugs, establishing a visual language that interior designers still study today. To Lee, a room wasn't finished unless it looked like a painting by Sargent. Life as a princess, however, was an expensive performance. The Radziwills moved between London, a turreted estate in Buckinghamshire called Turville Grange, and a constant rotation of villas in the south of France and palazzos in Italy. They were the original influencers, photographed by Cecil Beaton and Slim Aarons, embodying a life of leisure that seemed to exist outside the constraints of time or money. But the princess title was more than just a prefix. It was a shield. In Europe, Lee wasn't just Jackie's sister. She was Her Serene Highness, a woman who belonged to a lineage that predated the United States itself. This period allowed her to cultivate the independence she craved. She became a muse to designers like Giambattista Valli and Giorgio Armani, proving that she didn't need a White House backdrop to be the most compelling woman in the room. Yet, the jet-set life had a frantic quality. Stas was a man of immense charm but also immense volatility, and the financial pressures of maintaining multiple estates while keeping up with the Onassises of the world began to show. Lee began to realize that being a princess was a job, one that required a bottomless wardrobe and an even deeper well of social stamina. As the 60s faded into the 70s, the fairy tale marriage began to fray. The prince and the princess were drifting apart, fueled by the very excesses that had made them famous. But Lee had already learned the most important lesson of the jet-set era. Style is a currency that never devalues. Title and crown aside, Lee was never content to simply sit for portraits. She had a restless, creative hunger that drove her toward the stage and the studio. Stage fright and the Rolling Stones. Lee Radziwill was never content with the socialite label. She viewed it as a shallow box that ignored her restless, creative spirit. Unlike Jackie, whose public image was one of stoic permanence, Lee was a shapeshifter, constantly seeking a vocation that would grant her an identity independent of her family name. This search led her into a series of professional ventures that were often met with more curiosity than acclaim, yet they reveal a woman who was remarkably unafraid of public failure. Her most infamous foray into the arts was her brief, glittering attempt at an acting career. In the late 60s, encouraged by her close friend Truman Capote, who saw in her a swan's version of Audrey Hepburn, Lee took to the stage. Her debut as Tracy Lord in a Chicago revival of the Philadelphia story was a media circus. Every seat was filled with journalists waiting to see if a princess could actually perform. The reviews were tepid, but Lee pressed on. The peak of her theatrical ambition came in 1968 with the television play Laura. Portraying the titular femme fatale, Lee was under immense pressure to prove she wasn't just a vanity project. The result was, unfortunately, a critical disaster. Critics lambasted her performance as wooden and detached, famously noting that a princess is not an actress. It was a stinging public rebuke, but rather than retreating into seclusion, Lee simply pivots. She realized that while she couldn't inhabit a character, she could certainly inhabit a room. This realization birthed her career as an interior designer. In 1976, she founded Lee Radziwill Incorporated, focusing on an aesthetic she called civilized comfort. She eschewed the mid-century modernism taking over New York, instead opting for the layered European richness she had mastered in London. Her homes were not decorated, they were curated. She worked with the finest craftsmen, bringing a sense of old-world patina to the corporate suites of the Americana hotels and the private residences of Manhattan's elite. But perhaps the most surreal chapter of her creative life occurred in 1972, when she joined the Rolling Stones on their STP, Stones Touring Party, American tour. Picture the scene: the refined, silk-clad Princess Radziwill, accompanied by Truman Capote, traveling on a chartered jet nicknamed the Lapping Tongue with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Lee had been brought along ostensibly to help Capote write a piece for Rolling Stone magazine, but she ended up as the most unlikely member of the rock and roll circus. While groupies and roadies swirled in a haze of substances and high-volume blues, Lee remained remarkably herself. She was the calm, chic eye of the storm, often seen backstage in impeccable trousers, observing the chaos with the detached curiosity of a visiting dignitary. Though she later admitted she found some of the tour's excesses repulsive, the experience cemented her status as a woman who could bridge the gap between the stuffy establishment and the counterculture avant-garde. By the 80s, Lee finally found a professional home that matched her temperament, the world of high fashion. For nearly a decade, she served as a public relations executive and brand ambassador for Giorgio Armani. It was a role that didn't require her to act or decorate. It simply required her to be Lee. She was Armani's eyes and ears in the West, the bridge between Italian craftsmanship and American power. Armani once remarked that Lee was beyond passing trends, a sentiment that perfectly encapsulated her professional life. Of all her professional roles, however, none was as complex or as dangerous as her position in the court of Truman Capote, a swan who stayed. In the 60s and 70s, the only social currency more valuable than a title was a seat at Truman Capote's table. Capote, the diminutive titan of American letters, had a penchant for surrounding himself with a specific type of woman. Wealthy, impeccably groomed, and carrying a faint scent of tragedy. He called them his swans, and Lee Radziwill was perhaps the most complex bird in the flock. While Babe Paley was the perfect swan and Slim Keith was the sharp-tongued swan, Lee was Capote's Project Swan. He saw in her the ultimate Pygmalion opportunity. Truman was obsessed with Lee's rivalry with Jackie, famously writing to Cecil Beaton after their first meeting that Lee was so jealous of her sister it had become a disease. But instead of judging her, Truman weaponized that jealousy, positioning himself as her greatest advocate. He gushed to the press that Lee had all the things people give Jackie credit for, all the looks, style, taste. Jackie never had them all. For a decade, they were inseparable. They traveled to the Spanish coast, stayed at the finest palazzos, and shared a shorthand of gossip that would eventually prove fatal to their circle. In 1966, when Truman threw the legendary black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel, the party of the century, Lee was at the very center of the guest list, a princess in her prime. But the Swan era came to a screeching public halt in 1975. In a move that defined social self-harm, Truman published an excerpt of his long-awaited novel Answered Prayers in Esquire magazine. The chapter, titled La Côte Basque, 1965, was a thinly veiled exposé of the Swan's darkest secrets. He wrote of the Paleys' marital infidelities and hinted at a socialite who had gotten away with murder. The reaction was swift and merciless. The doors of Fifth Avenue townhouses were slammed in Truman's face. He was an outcast overnight. Yet, here is where Lee's story deviates from the rest. While Babe Paley and Slim Keith never spoke to Truman again, Lee remained, for a time, one of the few who refused to fully banish him. Why? Partly because she and Jackie had emerged from the Esquire piece relatively unscathed. Truman described them simply as Western geishas, and partly because she understood the transactional nature of the New York elite better than anyone. She knew that Truman's betrayal was born of a writer's hunger, not a personal vendetta. However, even the most loyal swan has her limits. As Truman's descent into alcoholism and substance abuse became more erratic, even Lee began to drift away. She watched as her mentor, the man who had tried to make her an actress and a star, turned into a caricature of himself. Their friendship didn't end with a bang like the others. It simply dissolved into the mist of the late 70s, leaving Lee as one of the few survivors of a social massacre. She had seen the rise and fall of a literary king, and she walked away with her reputation and her secrets intact. Motherhood and loss. The summer of two deaths. For a woman who spent her life meticulously curating her surroundings to avoid the unseemly, the summer of 1999 was a brutal intrusion of reality that no amount of silk or high society poise could mask. It was the year Lee Radziwill's world didn't just crack, it shattered. In the space of 3 weeks, she lost the two men who represented the future of her lineage and the last vestiges of her connection to the Camelot era: her son, Anthony Radziwill, and her nephew, John F. Kennedy Jr. Anthony was, by all accounts, the light of Lee's life. While she and Jackie had a relationship defined by sharp edges and strategic silences, Lee's bond with Anthony was one of profound protective warmth. He was a prince by birth, but a filmmaker by trade, an Emmy-winning producer for ABC who shared his mother's sharp eye and restless curiosity. But beneath the surface of his successful career was a grueling, decade-long battle with cancer. Lee watched, largely in private, as her son fought a disease that seemed determined to mock the Radziwill vitality. By 1999, Anthony was in his final days, resting at his summer home in the Hamptons. It was into this atmosphere of quiet, agonizing waiting that the news of July 16th broke. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane was missing. The tragedy was a double-edged sword for Lee. Not only was John her nephew, the son of the sister who had dominated her life, but he was Anthony's brother in spirit. The two cousins had grown up together, lean and athletic, the golden boys of a family that had seen too much darkness. When the wreckage of John's plane was found off Martha's Vineyard, Lee had to process a grief that was both personal and historical, all while her own son lay dying in the next room. Anthony passed away on August 10, 1999, just weeks after John was buried at sea. For Lee, this was the soul-destroying moment from which she never fully recovered. She famously remarked to the New York Times that she had cried herself out after the JFK assassination decades earlier. But when Anthony died, she found she only had inner tears. It was a grief so deep it became structural, changing the way she viewed the remainder of her life. This period of loss also complicated her relationship with her daughter-in-law, Carol Radziwill. While they shared the trauma of Anthony's death, the two women were cut from very different cloth. Carol was the modern, working-class American girl who had married into a dynasty. Lee was the woman who had spent decades building that dynasty's myth. In the aftermath of the funeral, the distance between them grew. Lee, ever the curator, seemed to retreat into a tighter, more exclusive circle, one that centered increasingly on her only surviving child, Anna Christina, Tina Radziwill. Tina had always been the more private of the two children. She didn't seek the limelight or the camera's flash, preferring to remain in the background as her mother's silent confidant. In the wake of Anthony's death, the bond between mother and daughter solidified into an impenetrable alliance. Tina became the guardian of Lee's waning years, the one who saw the woman behind the ambassador of chic mask. When people ask why Lee left her entire fortune to Tina, the answer isn't just in the legal clauses of a will. It is in the silence of that 1999 summer. Lee had seen the Kennedy brand swallowed by tragedy and public spectacle. She wanted her own legacy, and what remained of the Radziwill assets, to be protected by the person who had stayed by her side through the darkest hours. Yet, even as she retreated into her private grief, Lee's influence on the world of aesthetics never wavered. She remained, until her final breath, the ultimate arbiter of style, the gold standard of quiet luxury. Lee Radziwill did not merely wear clothes, she weaponized them. If Jackie was the brand, Lee was the blueprint. For decades, her fabled, wide-eyed prettiness served as a silent manifesto for a particular kind of American elegance, one that felt profoundly European, deeply intellectual, and utterly indifferent to the whims of the mall-walking public. As we look at the $50 million legacy she left behind, it is impossible to separate the liquid assets from the aesthetic ones. Her philosophy was rooted in a fierce rejection of the tabula rasa. She once remarked, "I abhor the American idea of starting with a clean slate every few years. When I buy something, I intend to keep it forever." This wasn't just about furniture. It was about a sense of self. She lived in a world where quality was the only true currency. Whether it was the Sicilian scarves she famously glued to the walls of her London dining room or the hundreds of pairs of Armani trousers she kept in her Manhattan Aerie, Lee's style was a study in consistency. She was the original influencer long before the term was cheapened by hashtags. Designers from Marc Jacobs to Michael Kors, who once dedicated an entire collection to the Lee look, spent decades trying to bottle her essence. Her recipe was deceptively simple: slim trousers, oversized sunglasses, a piqué shift dress, and a posture that suggested she had just stepped off a yacht in Amalfi, even if she was just walking her dogs on East 72nd Street. It was quiet luxury before the marketing teams gave it a name. In her final years, Lee became a guardian of a vanishing world. She viewed the modern obsession with youth and plastic surgery with a detached, aristocratic pity, opting instead for a face that reflected a life actually lived. "Regrets? I think everyone has regrets," she said. "People who say they haven't are either liars or narcissists." By leaving her fortune solely to her daughter, Tina, Lee ensured that her curated world remained intact, protected from the life diminishers she so carefully avoided. She died as she lived, on her own terms, with her secrets tucked away in a Cartier tank and her eyes firmly fixed on the next beautiful thing. She may have been born a Bouvier and lived as a princess, but in the end, Lee Radziwill was her own greatest creation, a woman who proved that while fame is fleeting, style is the only thing that truly survives the reading of the will. Thanks for watching till the end. For more deep dives like this, subscribe to our channel, and we hope you continue to support us.